Hello, Viking Travels. My name is Lara Bellenghi. I'm one of the art educators at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, the capital of Austria. And if you will have any questions for me while you watch the pre-recorded tour that I prepared for you, then please feel free to post them, and then after the live, after this live introduction and after the video, you'll see me back in this space. I'm welcoming you from my own home, but what you will be seeing shortly is a 25-minute walk through the picture gallery on the first floor of our museum. The picture gallery is divided up into two wings, and we decided to take you up north. So we're visiting two painters, Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was the master of the Flemish Renaissance, and then as an end note, we're also going to be visiting Johannes Vermeer of Delft, and the combination of these painters makes the tour span more or less a century. So we're beginning up in the area of Antwerp and Brussels in the 1560s, and then we're heading over to Delft in the 1660s. So we hope you'll be enjoying the tour, and I'll see you live in around 25 minutes again with your questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer all of them. So see you soon.
Hello, Viking Travels. My name is Lara, and we're welcoming you from the historical hall 10 of our picture gallery. This museum's picture gallery is divided up into two wings, and we're currently situated where the painters that worked north of the Alps are exhibited, so mainly Netherlandish and Flemish paintings. And the trick that we prepared for you today was breeze through the picture gallery with Peter Bruegel, and then towards the end of this tour I'll take you through to another hall where we will briefly be visiting Johannes Vermeer from Delft. So we're covering the Flemish Renaissance painter Bruegel, and then as an end note, but an extension of the Netherlandish and Flemish golden age of painting, will end with the 1660s in Delft. What I thought we could do today is, because you can only do this in this hall of our picture gallery, is to give you a quick survey of Peter Bruegel the Elder's career. This museum houses most of his paintings. There's 12 in the Hapsburg collections of the 40 to 41 paintings in the world, and it is only in this room that you can really get a sense of how his career progressed in painting. And I thought I'd take you through with a focus on the different genres that he mastered. Some know him as the painter of peasants, as you can tell probably behind me. I'll get to these two paintings in the back in a moment. Others know him as the painter of landscapes. We'll also be looking at those, but the earliest paintings that survive by him, and this is where we're heading now, are his so-called gefriemel paintings. Gefriemel is the Flemish or Dutch term for a busy hustle and bustle, and it applies to these two works that you see here. On the right, from the 1550s, just after Peter Bruegel had visited Italy, he paints Carnival that battles against Lent. And then next to it, we'll be looking at that in a moment as well, the children's games. And these two paintings are part of a trilogy, together with one in Berlin called the Netherlandish Proverbs. But the title of the Netherlandish Proverbs would apply to these two works likewise, because Peter Bruegel, very much in Northern European and Flemish tradition, illustrates proverbs or figures of speech that often carried a moralizing message. But what we also will understand even if the time is too brief to do Peter Bruegel justice in this tour, what we will be able to understand is how he will, throughout the 2 decades that he will be most active as a painter, that he will return to these busy paintings and extract some of the figures and some of the activities that you see here in miniature format, and then recontextualize them in other paintings. Perhaps I'll point this out in this painting over here, but let's look at it in detail, because at first sight some of these compositions are quite daunting because they seem so chaotic. But there's much more structure than you would expect in Carnival that battles against Lent. It's also an ideal painting to talk about at this time of the year. We're in the middle of the Carnival season. And Peter Bruegel here paints the transition from Fat Tuesday, from Mardi Gras, to Ash Wednesday. If one were to zoom out of the painting, then one can see that there is a cuboid structure in the center, which is a well. And in the middle of a well, you see a metal chain. And it is at this point where you could draw a line that dissects the painting in two and gives the impression that you could fold it up and open again as if it were a book. This is interesting because Peter Bruegel was trained as a miniature painter who decorated calendars and books. So this is something that he may have applied here as a concept. And that means that the painting is split in two. We see Carnival on the left, and we see Lent beginning with Ash Wednesday on the right. And the two antagonists that stand for these two days in the year are seen up front as they encounter each other in battle. The gentleman riding on a red barrel with red stockings is Prince Carnival, who's, you can tell, even if it's a miniature format, you can tell that he's bursting from all seams, so he can't even swallow the shepherd's pie, which he's now balancing on his head. And his antagonist is Lady Lent, and you can tell that around her there's no more tasty food. There's dried pretzels and crackers and herrings, so the food that would be consumed during Ash Wednesday. Another thing that is perhaps interesting, and I would really encourage you, if you're into these details, we have a website called insidebruegel.org. Please look it up. You can use a scroll function to zoom into the paintings, and that is where you get Peter Bruegel up close, and all these visual codes that allow you to understand the paintings better are very palpable there. Here, you can only see them probably if you look very close, and one such detail is the ash cross on the forehead of the little boy looking up to Lady Lent. And the same holds true for her forehead. They both have an ash cross, which stands for Ash Wednesday. And that in turn explains why on the right side of the painting, in the time of year where modesty is meant to be practiced, we see a representation of charity. In the bottom right corner, you can see a begging woman and a man who's about to give her some money. And at the same time, just behind that group, you will see Peter Bruegel himself talking to a group of blind people. The man who's wearing a fur-brimmed coat over there with his hand in his pocket is most likely the only self-portrait of Peter Bruegel within his painting. So this is also a treat that we have a self-portrait of Peter Bruegel in this picture gallery, but it's camouflaged in the hustle and bustle of this general composition. We'll move on in a second, but just to give you an idea of how often Peter Bruegel was an observer of daily life and of the details that perhaps helped us to understand when people were living through different stages, I wanted to point out this detail in the bottom left corner. So we just saw the begging woman as a representation of charity on the far right, and here in the bottom left corner, you see a representation of gluttony, and also the fact that people played with food. So this is where Peter Bruegel captures the decadence of the world. He's often been called a moralist who points out the sins and the virtues of humankind. And in this sense, this painting kind of represents these two conflicting natures that are often part of one human being. That's a lot of detail for one painting. Let's jump to the children's games, because from here we can then wander over to his most iconic painting in our picture gallery, the Tower of Babel. The children's games that you see here represent 60 games, most of which have been replaced by electronic gadgets, but some of these games are actually activities as they pertain to human life today, without which we couldn't really live the lives that we're living. And what I mean specifically here can be seen in the bottom right corner. I'm a fan of corners, as you can tell. You can see that there's a kind of brick factory down there. There's a lady who is just preparing a brick, and then there's the sand pit, and just behind the sand pit you can see that somebody has started to lay the base for a round brick tower. And bear in mind that this is, as I said earlier, one of his earliest paintings that survives. And a couple of years later, 6 to 7 years later, he paints his Tower of Babel. And it is only in this room that you can make these connections between the early paintings and then how he extracts some of these details and then goes on to paint in the early 1560s, especially 1562 and 1563, his most perhaps conceptually and compositionally refined pieces. So why don't we head over there and look at the Tower of Babel in detail. And now that you have the bricks from the children's games in mind, you will be able to spot them here very quickly. It's almost as if they had been recycled and placed into the painting here. Peter Bruegel the Elder paints the Tower of Babel twice in the same year, in 1563. The second version is in the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam. But this one has become the most famous painting. And it is due to the collectorship of the Hapsburg Emperor Rudolf II that it has been in our picture gallery and has almost always been on show, which in turn then explains why there is such an important presence of Peter Bruegel the Elder's paintings in Vienna, although he himself never visited here, and he was also not a painter at the court. Let me just give you a few details about this painting, because there's, again, as always is the case with Peter Bruegel, a lot going on. He traveled to Italy, and what is curious about him is that he didn't really focus on the Italian art that he would have been exposed to. He seems to have been much more interested in the landscape and in the architecture. And this is represented here in that, for one, the Tower of Babel is evocative of the Colosseum, because we know that Peter Bruegel had made it to Rome. And at the same time, it is also evocative of the two volcanoes that he will have seen, because Peter Bruegel managed to get past Naples and also towards Sicily. So he knew the Etna and the Vesuvius. And if you look at this Tower of Babel from a distance and consider that the red core of the tower is red, it is sort of resemblant of the magma chamber of a volcano. So there's many different ways with which one could start to decipher this painting. But it's also, and this is one detail I will point out, because then it takes us on to Johannes Vermeer. Peter Bruegel here introduces a genre that really became popular in the Netherlands in the 17th and 18th century. So he's way ahead of his game here. What you see in the bottom right is the port. And very likely this is the port of Naples. Peter Bruegel is the pioneer of the marine landscape. And it's something that is also a reminder of how painters and cartographers at the time were rather close. And Peter's best friend, in fact, was the leading cartographer of the time, a man called Abraham Ortelius. And so the way that Peter Bruegel structures the information of the world in his paintings is almost a translation of how cartographers would have structured the world's information on a map. I hope this is making sense. Let me know if it isn't. As always, questions then will be welcome. Let us move on to 2-3 paintings that were painted somewhat later. So we're here in the 1560s, 62, 63, And here we're approaching a fragment of a cycle that Peter Bruegel painted, a cycle of seasons. And these 3 paintings in the middle are part of 5. Peter Bruegel was commissioned most likely by a Flemish merchant called Nicolas de Jongeling to paint a cycle of seasons in one room. And the most famous of these 5 paintings are The Hunters in the Snow. One other painting is in the Metropolitan Museum, that would be the summer painting. And then one, the spring painting, is in Prague in the Palais Lobkowitz. You might be asking yourselves why there's not only 4 paintings, given that there's 4 seasons. But you remember that Peter Bruegel was keen on showing transitions. With Carnival that battled against Lent, it was transitions from one day to another, from Fat Tuesday to Ash Wednesday. Whereas here we see how he makes our eye wander from one painting to another as if we were reading through a comic strip. Peter Bruegel is a great inspiration for cinematographers, for choreographers, because in fact his paintings are often telling stories, and he employs a diagonal line which generally dissects the painting, and around that diagonal line we understand how we're meant to read it. And what we're doing here with The Hunters in the Snow, we're essentially following the dogs and the hunters whose hunt was not successful. We're following them back into the valley where they came from. Peter Bruegel doesn't represent the glories of kings and queens and emperors. He much rather documents the hardships that Flemish Protestants lived through. And some of these hardships included the Small Ice Age. A lot of people froze to death. And what is interesting is how Peter Bruegel tries to always find some form of solution, some form of resolution to these hardships, which explains why, although the Hunters in the Snow have not been able to find any hair, they return to the valley where you see people ice skating. So out of the worst of situations, Peter Bruegel manages to capture also the lighter moments. So we see that he often tries to balance out the content of his paintings. Because I said that we can read his paintings, it's also, I think, an interesting thing to point out how from The Hunters in the Snow, the evident winter painting, one wanders towards early spring. You can see that what we just saw in the painting to the left, a fragment has been kept in the top left corner. You see a remnant of the winter landscape. The snow is slowly melting. Our eye is gazing across the painting here over the stream, which is also employed again according to the diagonal line principle. And what we understand is how, as our eye wanders to the bottom right corner, the snow has melted, and we see what nature yields once the snow is gone. The temperature in this painting has changed, and our eye is finally fixating on a group of men who are celebrating carnival. We already saw a few waffles that Peter Bruegel painted in Carnival that battled against Lent, but this is something that he often employs. He likes to point out the gluttony of humankind. So he's continued painting waffles here, but it is really only a very tiny detail that gives away the carnival season, and that is the crown, the paper crown worn by the little man bending down to pick up a lantern. His crown is painted with tiny sunflowers. So we have a few details here, although this painting is relatively void of human existence, that allow us to understand what time of year it is and what festivities might be going on. I think before we head over to Vermeer, another duo of paintings that are pertinent, also because they round off this room in as far as the two paintings we're about to see now were painted at the end of Peter Bruegel's life. 1.5 years to 2 years before he died, he paints one of his most iconic paintings, the so-called Peasant Wedding, and then on the right you have what is probably its counterpart, the Peasant Dance. You see that the figures here are much larger. He no longer exercises miniature painting, and it is also in this painting that we see a bit more of an Italian influence in the faces. For example, the man whom you see standing to the far left of this painting, who is pouring wine from one jug into the other, has a face that is more comparable to what in Italian one could call la bella figura, anatomical correctness. It's a very different kind of face to the one that you see just behind him, the bagpipe player, who is staring out. But if you look close, he's not staring at us, he's staring passively out into the void. So this is also quite curious. You will never see people in Peter Bruegel's paintings that look right out at you. They're always kind of off, and the same holds true for the bagpipe player. The big mystery in this painting has always been who the groom was. We do not know for certain, but we do know who the bride is. She is seated there, as was customary in Northern Europe for a long time. The bride wore black. She's the lady sitting in front of the green cloth, and a paper crown above her head is hovering. And she looks a little sleepy, so there's also often a bit of humor, possibly sleepy because she's tired of waiting for her groom. One more thing to point out here before we head over to Vermeer is that this is possibly Peter Bruegel's most claustrophobic composition. You can barely see an open space. Peter Bruegel is often known for painting beautiful skies. You see barely any open space here except for in the far left corner over there, which gives the idea that the crowd that we see here is spilling out into a square that would be placed right in front of the hut. And there's a detail in the painting next to it that really does allow for this interpretation, because there is a hut here which very likely could be the one we just looked at in the peasant's wedding, and there's a man pulling out possibly his wife or a woman for certain to dance into the middle of the square. So this is something that kind of, unfortunately, we do not know for certain whether these two paintings were conceived as a duo, but this detail kind of would allow for this interpretation. All right, I think that at this point it makes sense that we go and visit Johannes Vermeer. That means that we're leaving this room. The art of painting that you see here by Johannes Vermeer is his largest piece, and we know that it was the last painting to have stayed in his studio. Even after he died, he tried to keep it in the family. It eventually then went on sale, but that also gives us the idea that he used it up until the end of his life to show off his skills, to show what it was that he was able to paint. This room, which has been installed with a lot of benches, shows our masterpieces of the so-called Dutch Golden Age, the Dutch Gouden Eeuw. So we're looking at more or less 100 years, a century after Peter Bruegel. And the detail that I wanted to connect here to the tour that I gave you in Hall 10 just earlier was the map. Johannes Vermeer, just like Peter Bruegel and many other Northern European artists, refers to landscapes but also cartography. And here, as is often the case, Vermeer is known for having integrated elements of maps in his paintings, but in this one here, he shows the most comprehensive map. And if you look close, you will be able to tell that it's a 90-degree turn of the Netherlands to the right. And it's a reproduction from an atlas. What is interesting is that you see a few cracks, and the central crack in this map runs through Breda, which is where the religious wars were fought between the Protestants and the Catholics, and that eventually led to the separation of the Dutch northern and southern provinces, which means that Amsterdam becomes the capital of painting and culture after the separation of the southern provinces. I will also point out a few of the materials that you see here, because the painting in itself is something of a showroom. We know that Johannes Vermeer, in order to earn a bit of money, was also a dealer in antiquities, and the most precious object that you see here is not in fact the painting itself, but it is the curtain, which isn't just a curtain. If you look close, you will be able to see that there are knobs of stitches, because this is tapestry work, and the hours of labor that went into tapestry work by far exceeded the hours that would have been necessary to complete the painting. So time here is of the essence, and it determines the preciousness and the price of the fabric. But time is also of the essence in that Vermeer here paints a work that is called the Allegory of painting, so it is a tribute to painting, but really it is perhaps even more so a tribute to the relationship between painting and history, because the man whom we see here at work could be Vermeer. We do not know whether this is intended as a self-portrait, but it is a painter, no doubt. And the lady in the blue dress would be Clio, the muse of history, the daughter of Mnemosyne, the daughter of memory. And so in her yellow book that she is holding, the stories and the history of the world is contained, and the trumpet that she holds in her right hand is there for her to continue telling the stories out into the world through the window. We do not see the window, but it is clear that she is standing next to it, because in this abstract triangular space that you see here, Vermeer has really integrated a celebration of light in its own right, because it is the brightest part of the work after the painter's shoulders. So there's quite a few ways of looking at this painting. Perhaps if we consider that he was from Delft, and we consider that the sunlight in the Netherlands is relatively rare, it makes sense that light in itself is being treated as such a precious element that Vermeer carves out an entire space for light itself. And this is what we see here next to Clio, which then in turn leads to her facial features being quite nondescript. We do not know who she is, whether this was a real model or not, because often the faces in paintings of Vermeer are consumed by light. And I think with that, we will be ending the tour for today. I'll see you in a moment live on screen. I hope you've collected a few questions and we can start conversing. And then hopefully one day you'll be able to see the picture gallery, because there's far too much to see here to cover the half hour that I've been talking to you now. Thank you for being here, and hopefully live soon. Bye.
Thank you so much, Lara, for sharing that wonderful tour. We've now got some questions that have come in from our guests. Our first question we'll go to tonight comes from Bill, and he's in Windsor in Ontario, Canada. And he says, in the Peter Bruegel gallery, there appears to be, at least on screen, a predominant use of yellow shades. Is this related to the type of canvas or just a colour of choice?
Hello, Bill. Hi from Vienna. It's true, the predominant color hues in the historical room 10 are indeed that warmish yellow. For one, because of the pigments that were available. Peter Bruegel worked mainly between Antwerp and Brussels, and Antwerp was an important port city, and we know that he used saffron as a pigment. So many of the yellows that you see in his paintings were made with saffron. And then the other part of your question included canvas, I think, but he mainly worked on Baltic oak wood. There are very few paintings which he made on canvas, and in our picture gallery, all of them are on wood. So if you wanted to see a painting by Peter Bruegel on a piece of cloth, you could go to Naples, to the Museo Capodimonte, which is where he paints a painting called The Blinds Fall. And then there are two small canvas paintings at the Prado in Madrid. But the paintings in the Vienna Picture Gallery are all on wood.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lara. A question here from Katrina. She's in Indiana in the United States. And she says, what type of paints did Peter Bruegel use? He achieved an incredible level of accuracy.
The paints were all mainly self-made, so whichever pigments he was able to make for himself, or so generally pigments are won from either beetles' wings or stones like lapis lazuli, which is not necessarily a material that Peter Bruegel used, but other stones he would have ground to powder, and then he mixed them with oils, and that would give him that the necessary texture, which is something like a toothpaste texture, which you then can apply to the canvas, and you can actually use with the paintbrush. And sometimes, but very rarely, painters of his time chose tempera over oil, so egg white rather than oil as a binding substance. But the pigments that he won were either plant-based or taken from gemstones, or beetle wings were often used as well.
Wonderful, thank you. A question here from Regina in Los Angeles, and she says, did Bruegel gain prominence or profit during his lifetime?
This is a very good question insofar as he was never a painter at court, so he didn't have the privileges that normally artists of his caliber would have had. And he was, we had a big, sorry, I'm deviating a little, but we had a big, the first big retrospective about Peter Bruegel was only 3 years ago in our picture gallery. And there are still very lively discussions around him possibly having been a Protestant or even an atheist, so definitely not somebody who would have been particularly welcomed by the Spanish Netherlands and the Catholic Hapsburgs that were occupying the Spanish Netherlands. So it's a bit of a miracle that he wasn't persecuted, because some of his paintings seem to make very clear political statements. They seem to side very much with the Flemish Protestants. He paints various torture scenes. The subject of war is often seen in his paintings, but also in his drawings and in his prints. So it makes sense that during his lifetime, none of the rulers over the territories that he lived in were his direct sponsors. The man who was most generous towards Peter Bruegel was probably a Jewish Flemish merchant called Nicholas de Jongeling. So we know from his inventory that he owned 12 Peter Bruegel paintings.
Thank you so much, Lara. And a little bit similar to that, so we have Frida in Asheville. She says, do we know how Bruegel's works were received at the time? Was he looked down upon because he painted scenes of peasants and everyday life?
Not really. I mean, they were popular with the Flemish Protestants and with people that would have been like himself from that side of society. But of course, for the Catholic Habsburgs, that would not have been the kind of genre that was deemed as high art. And it's then interesting to consider how Peter Bruegel became popular throughout history, especially, say, in the early 20th century in Russia, which explains why there are so many copies of Peter Bruegel paintings of peasants working specifically in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So the reception of Peter Bruegel has changed over time. But to go back to your question, his contemporaries, amongst his contemporaries, those that were living a similarly difficult life, would have supported his work if they were able to pay for it, because you have to also bear in mind there were some conditions that affected everyone, like the small ice age, famine. So these hardships were not just specific to peasants. Peter Bruegel didn't work in the service of power, but he documented the hardships that everybody felt. So in that sense, he would have been appreciated. But one has to say that there's very little primary sources that allow us to say for certain how his work was received during his lifetime. his biography was written only in 1604, so a couple of decades after he died. And from that, this is a document written by the Dutch art historian called Karel van Mander. And from that, a bit of Peter Bruegel's career was reconstructed, because Karel van Mander did meet him in person, but the biography was written much later, so posthumously.
Thank you so much, Lara. Question here from Tony in Springfield in the United States, and he asks, do we have any idea of how much time Bruegel would have spent on the paintings with so much detail, such as the Great Tower of Babel?
Usually he took 1 year. He was actually incredibly productive. This has to do with him working relatively. He applied paint very thinly. So sometimes the priming, the first layer that he applied, the prime layer of paint that he applies directly on the oak wood, shimmers through because he applies the oil paint so thinly that it almost gives it a translucent character, and that means that the paintings themselves dried quite quickly, and generally they're only dated 1 year. So the Tower of Babel was painted in 1563, and there are no suggestions that he reworked that painting over the course of a couple of years. And also bear in mind that all the paintings that exist so there's around 40, some say 41. All these 40 paintings were painted within 20 years. So he was quite quick at working, actually. And in the year 1562 and 1563, he was probably most productive.
Thank you, Lara. Our next question is from Kathleen. She's in Corvallis in the United States, and she says, the paintings look so bright and clean. Have they recently been restored? And if so, where is this done? Does the Kunsthistorisches Museum have its own restoration department? I'd love to visit.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because it opens up the big chapter of conservation and of the backstage work in museums in general. And when we held the exhibition, this big retrospective, it was called Peter Bruegel, The Hand of the Master. On occasion of that exhibition, there was an international consortium of curators and of conservators that set more or less standard parameters on how the Bruegel paintings were meant to be treated. But we do, in fact, within our museum have a restoration department. And because most of the paintings are in Vienna, most of the parameters were actually set by the conservators in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And then there were a few conservators, like a gentleman called Ron Spronk, who was Dutch, but he's based in Canada. He was also involved. There were different committee members that decided what the temperatures had to be when these paintings were all in Vienna, as much as certain pigment analyses had to undergo certain regulations. But I'm not a conservator, so I'm not going to go into the chemistry of it all. But there is a department within our museum where condition reports about the Peter Bruegel paintings are made, and they often serve many other museums that have Peter Bruegels in their collections as a parameter on how to treat them.
Wonderful, thank you. A question now from Alan. He's in Manchester in the United Kingdom, and he says, thank you so much for sharing the details of these paintings. I have to say they remind me of Lowry. Can you comment on this, and if Bruegel is known to be an influence on Lowry?
Lowry? I'm afraid I have no idea who that is.
No worries, okay.
Lowry.
Next question here is from Scarlett. She's in Largo in the United States, and she asks, does the museum have any paintings by Peter's son, Peter Bruegel the Younger?
Yes, and also Jan Bruegel the Elder. it gets a bit confusing because there are various sons of Peter Bruegel, and we do have a few paintings by both sons. But of the two, between Peter Bruegel the younger and Jan Bruegel the elder, Jan Bruegel the elder was definitely the more appreciated artist.
Wonderful, thank you. Now we have Alejandro. He's in Sugarland in the United States, and he asks, how many hours is the minimum that you would recommend to spend in the museum?
Depends on what you like to see, but I think you'd have to plan a couple of visits, because the picture gallery is just one part of the museum. We also have a Greco-Roman and Egyptian section, and then the museum houses something that can really only be found in Vienna. It's a very large cabinet of curiosities. So around a quarter of the museum shows what can be called a kind of playground of emperors, because the cabinet of curiosities, or the so-called, we call them a Kunstkammer, so a cabinet of wonders, contains objects that were predominantly made and commissioned in order to entertain at court. So anything that would have served as a pastime when wars weren't being waged, so anything that had to do with eating, drinking, and specifically playing games or keeping the mind active. So that includes automatas, that includes clocks, that includes incredible goldsmiths' works. So if you're more up for that, so three-dimensional objects and miniature sculptures, but also prototypes of robots, because that's what these automata were, then you might really want to come back to the museum. If you're there, say, for a week, if you visit Vienna for a week, you may want to come back on multiple occasions, because it really is a lot to take in during one visit. And the picture gallery itself houses numerous masterpieces. But then I don't know how long you need to look at them in detail.
Wonderful, thank you, Lara. A question here now from Royalyn, and they're in Lawrence in the United States. And they ask, what happened to the museum and its collections during World War II?
That's a tricky one, but it's a very important question, because what happened to many museums and to many collections during World War II is that the paintings were hung down and then stored. There were different storage sites around Austria. One place was called Castle Immendorf, for example, which is also where paintings by Viennese modernist painters like Gustav Klimt were being stored. But then another more unfortunate chapter, as pertains to the history of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, is that it was bombed during World War II. The cafe, so more or less you've seen the introductory image to this talk, and the cupola that you see, the main cupola of the museum, is where the cafe is situated. So that part was bombed as well. But there were no paintings in the picture gallery at the time. So the damage was done to the building, which today is 130 years old, but at the time there were fortunately no paintings. And another highly sensitive chapter that needs more attention, perhaps, that demands more attention, is Adolf Hitler himself, because he was planning his so-called Führer Museum in Linz, the city that he was from, and he had commissioned various ministers of culture, specifically Hermann Göring, to pick and choose the best paintings for his museum. And Göring actually had set his eye on Vermeer's art of painting, which explains why it is today in our picture gallery. This was not bought by the Hapsburgs. It was an acquisition during the 1940s. If this is something that interests you, then I can refer you to a recent publication that the museum brought out about the directorship of Gustav Gluck. Gustav Gluck, who was the picture gallery's director during the 30s had to then leave the museum. He had to leave his post because he was of Jewish descent. And just last year there came out a very interesting publication about what he had done to the picture gallery in the 1930s and 1920s, and then what happened after that. So it's very interesting. There's so much. This is a huge territory. We don't have time to go into that, but there are a few publications on the picture gallery and the museum between World War I and World War II.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lara.
So I can just add, because if you're interested in World War II, one could also go into what happened after World War I. And as soon as the First World War ended in 1918, Italian troops came into the picture gallery and hung down around 20 paintings and took them to Italy right away, because the empire had collapsed. And so what used to be the Crown lands, or some of the northern Italian territory or Eastern European territories that belonged to the monarchy, laid claim on cultural heritage that was in Vienna, and then took it back home. So sorry, you asked about World War II, but I then assume that you might also be interested in the history of the picture gallery related to World War I as well.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Our next question is from Donnelly. She's in Toronto, Canada. And she says, what are the most famous other masters paintings in the collection?
There's so many. There are 3 Caravaggio paintings in our picture gallery. So maybe the figurehead of the Roman school around 1600. But then we also have one of the absolute masterpieces of the High Renaissance by Raphael, the Madonna in the Landscape. We also have masterpieces by Parmigianino, a painter who is categorized as a Mannerist painter who came from Parma. We also have quite a few Giorgione paintings, and specifically the Hapsburgs were quite keen on the Venetian Renaissance. So the Kunsthistorisches Museum has one of the world's most comprehensive Venetian Renaissance collections. And then Rubens is very present. We have some of the altarpieces that used to be in Antwerp in the Jesuit church there in our picture gallery today. What else? There's a few paintings by painters of the Dutch Golden Age. So we've seen, or you have seen, Vermeer, but we have a couple of Rembrandt paintings. One of his most important self-portraits from 1652, which basically never leaves Vienna. So there's a lot to see. I'm sure I've missed a few. Titian, of course, we have the world's second largest Titian collection. I mentioned the Venetian Renaissance, but the most important chunk of that is the Titian collection. The largest one is in Madrid in the Prado, but the other one is in Vienna.
Perfect. Thank you very much. A couple of questions here. We have Bill in Chicago and also Harry in Indiana, and they would like to know about the tours that are available when they visit the museum, and specifically, will you be available to lead any of the tours?
Yes, that's what the education department is for. So if you want to book tours, you can get in touch with the department. The address can be found on the website under Discovering the Museum, because that is where you have a drop-down menu on how tours can be booked. But if you want, I can spell out the address for you. It's a German word and it's long. In the German language, you can piece together lots of words, and then it sounds a bit funny. So shall I do that?
Thank you, Lara. We'll send it by email to those guests afterwards.
And whether I'm available, depending on when you will be visiting, I'm here most of April.
Wonderful. Thank you. A question now from Lauren in Maryland, and she just asks, how did you get into this profession and what did you study to become such an expert?
I don't know, expert is maybe a bit exaggerated, but I started studying at university as a modern linguist, so comparative literature, Czech and German. But then I switched to fine arts, so I hold a BFA in fine arts, and I added a master's at the Courtauld Institute in London, where I focused on European modernism, specifically on the function of postcards as a medium to disseminate art. And today I've been working at the Kunsthistorisches Museum since 2018, and before that I worked at the Guggenheim in Venice. So I don't just focus on one place or one era. It's very, very much a mixed batch.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And probably the last question we've got time for tonight. It's a nice comment and a question. This is from Regina, again in Los Angeles, and she says, "Thank you, Lara. You're a remarkably articulate and erudite docent." And she says, "I hope to remember many of the facts you've offered today." She says, "Can you give an idea of how artwork reaches possession of a museum from its origin? What is the journey from one generation to another to finally reach the museum?"
It really depends on the nature of the institution, because if the museum became a museum after it was somebody's home, then the collection was generally a private one, and often in that case, the heirs, the extended family or close friends of whoever collected would insist on keeping the collection intact as it was left by the collector. But then there's cases like a state museum or like the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which is state funded. But its existence today is mainly an extension of the Hapsburg Empire. So we're looking at, if you were to visit the Kunsthistorisches Museum, you're witnessing 800 years of Habsburg collectorship, but then also what I mentioned earlier, some paintings were acquired after the fall of the monarchy, and some of them would have possibly had to go back to the families that they were taken from. So if we were to use the Vermeer painting as an example, this was bought in inverted commas because really the owners, it was a Czechoslovak family of noble origin. They were called Černin. It's a family that still exists, and they today would have to actually be the owners of had history not taken the course that it took, they would still be the owners of that painting, but the painting is in our picture gallery. In 2010, there was a big exhibition about this in order to show that the family and the state had eventually come to an agreement. So it really does depend on how big the museum is and how many special cases there are like this one of Vermeer. I realize this is a bit of a convoluted question to your answer, but it really depends on what kind of museum you're looking at when you think of origin and the state of a collection or a museum today. And one also has to say that there are some museums that just don't have extra space to acquire new works of art. And other museums are specifically built in such a way that that some of their spaces can be still filled up. In our case, as is the case for many picture galleries that really are the fruits of empire, there are external sites and deposits where a lot of other treasures are held because there's just not enough physical space to keep it all under one roof.
Thank you so much, Lara. That's a brilliant answer to a big question. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight and for answering so many questions.
Sure. Was that it? You still have a bit of time, so I don't know if there was anybody else who wanted to.
If you're sure, yes, we can certainly ask another one. Let's have a look. We have Margaret, she's in Puerto Rico, and she asks, going back to Bruegel, did he have any other means of income, or did he make all his money from painting?
It would have had to be painting only. Yeah. in his case. But again, as I said earlier, there's very little first-hand information that we have about Peter Bruegel. In the case of Vermeer, it's a bit easier. We know that he dealt in antique furniture to earn a bit of extra money.
Wonderful, thank you. And one more here from David in Orlando, and he says, in the fight between the Carnival and Lent painting, who does the man with the cone-shaped hat behind the butcher represent? If you know which refers to.
It's a busy painting with a lot of people. He's dressed in a carnival's costume, right? They all. If it's on the left side of the painting, that there are quite a few random figures dressed up in carnival costume. So if he's wearing a cone-shaped hat, I think he stands for a fool. Paper hats generally stood for being foolish or stupid, and these are topics that Peter Bruegel liked to explore. So the pitfalls of humankind. And in that painting specifically, on the left, where he deals with carnival, he represents a couple of sins, and then on the right, he represents some virtues.
Wonderful, thank you, Lara. And maybe one more fun one to finish on. This one's from Matthew in Wallingford in the United States, and he says, with Vienna being known for its coffee shops, is there one near the museum that you would personally recommend?
Yeah, there's a few. So the probably the most elegant or sophisticated one is Café Landmann. So that's one of the classical grand Viennese cafes. That's quite close. And then also Café Central is very close by. Those two. But if you're traveling when all the restrictions have loosened, perhaps try and book a table, because you may have to queue outside otherwise.
Fantastic, thank you. And we just have a comment here. This is from Miki. She's one of our very, very regular viewers. And she says, thank you, Lara, for bringing me back to my homeland, the Netherlands, and with the very well-known paintings and my favourite painter, Vermeer. Since today is my 90th birthday, this has been a special watch for her.
Oh, that's so cute. May I ask where from? Is that allowed? Because I grew up in the Netherlands for 10 years.
Oh, I can't ask her because it's just a comment she sent in through the back, but I'm sure she'll very much appreciate to know that we've asked it. Well, thank you very much. I think that's all the questions we've had for this evening. So thank you for answering so many of them.
Sure. Okay, great. Hope you can all make it to Vienna in not too long. So we're almost through this. It feels like it. Some Viking travels have made it here in September, October last year. So hopefully it'll be easier with the next summer.